Your org chart says you manage 40 people. Your brain says otherwise, and your brain is right. There is a hard ceiling on how many humans one person can actually know, and once you see where that ceiling comes from, a lot of what looks like bad management turns out to be basic biology instead. In the 1990s, British anthropologist Robin Dunbar was studying primates, not offices. He noticed something strange. Across dozens of primate species, brain size predicted group size. Specifically, the relative size of the neocortex, the newer outer layer of the brain responsible for complex thought, tracked closely with how large a stable social group that species could maintain. Bigger relative neocortex, bigger stable group. Smaller neocortex, smaller group. The pattern wasn't loose. It held up strikingly well, species after species, once Dunbar plotted the numbers. Dunbar then asked an obvious but bold question. If this pattern holds across monkeys, apes, and every other primate on the chart, what does it predict for humans? He plugged human brain proportions into the same equation the other primates fit. The answer came out to roughly 150. Not 150 faces you'd recognize in a crowd. 150 relationships you could actually track. Who these people are, your history together, whether you trust them, and roughly what they'd think of you if you called in a favor tomorrow. That number is now known as Dunbar's number, and it has held up remarkably well across decades of follow-up research, from historical village sizes to modern phone contact lists to online communities, which tend to flatten out at a similar range once you filter down to relationships with any real depth behind them. Why would a hard limit exist at all? Because relationships aren't free. Dunbar's underlying argument is that maintaining a relationship costs cognitive effort. You have to hold someone's situation in memory. You have to update that picture as they change. You have to track subtle social information. Who's annoyed at whom? Who did whom a favor? Who can be trusted with what? All of that runs on the same limited mental bandwidth you use for everything else. And bandwidth doesn't expand just because your company added more people to the payroll. Past a certain group size, the brain simply runs out of room to keep everyone's context loaded at once, and relationships start getting thinner, more distant, and harder to maintain with any real trust behind them. Dunbar even connected this to language itself. His theory, widely cited in his later work, is that human language evolved partly as a replacement for the physical grooming that other primates use to maintain social bonds. Chimpanzees groom each other for hours, picking through fur, and that shared time is what keeps a bond stable. Humans, Dunbar argued, needed a faster way to maintain far more relationships than physical grooming alone could support. So we evolved conversation and gossip as a kind of vocal grooming, something that lets us maintain a bond in a 2-minute conversation instead of an hour of physical contact. It's a strange thought that idle small talk at work is doing roughly the same social job that a chimpanzee does with its hands. The number 150 isn't one flat category either. Dunbar described it as a series of nested circles, each one smaller and more demanding of attention than the one around it. About 5 people sit in the innermost circle, the ones you'd call without hesitating at 3 in the morning. About 15 sit in a close layer, people you'd trust with something genuinely difficult. Around 50 sit in a wider circle, people you'd want at a major personal event. And the full 150 are the people you could walk up to at an airport and strike up a real conversation with without it feeling strange to either of you. Each inner ring costs disproportionately more attention than the ring outside it. The 5 people in your innermost circle take up far more of your actual social energy than the 100 people sitting out in the wider band, even though they're a tiny fraction of the total headcount. You can map those same rings onto an org chart and get an oddly useful diagnostic tool. The innermost 5 map roughly onto a leader's true core team, the people whose judgment they'd trust on a hard call without a second opinion. The next 15 map onto the wider set of people across a company a leader actually knows well enough to place in the right role on instinct, not from a resume. The 50 map onto everyone in a building a leader could greet by name and have a real, specific conversation with. And the full 150 map onto the outer edge of, I recognize you and know roughly what you do here, the point past which a new hire is, socially speaking, a stranger wearing a badge. Used honestly, that mapping tells a leader something their headcount report never will. Not how many people work for the company, but how many of them the leader could actually vouch for as a person, not a line item. Remote and hybrid work tightens this ceiling further, if anything. A lot of what used to update someone's mental picture of a colleague for free, a hallway run-in, an overheard joke, someone visibly having a rough day, doesn't happen automatically anymore. Every bit of that context now has to be built deliberately, through a scheduled call or a message, instead of absorbed as a side effect of sharing a building. That doesn't expand the ceiling. It just means each relationship above a certain size needs more conscious effort per person to stay at the same depth it used to reach for free. This isn't just an academic curiosity. Organizations have collided with this number directly, sometimes without ever naming what they were running into. One well-known materials science company, recognized worldwide for a waterproof fabric used across outdoor gear, capped the size of its individual factories at around 150 employees for decades. When a plant grew past that headcount, the company didn't just let it keep expanding. It split the plant into 2 separate facilities instead. By the company's own account, the reasoning was straightforward. Past roughly that size, people stopped really knowing each other by name and history. Trust, that used to be automatic, built from just working alongside someone long enough to know them, started needing formal rules and processes to replace it. So the company split its sites deliberately, again and again, rather than let any single facility outgrow the size where everyone still recognized everyone else on the floor. Militaries reached a similar conclusion centuries before Dunbar gave the pattern a name. Historically, basic fighting units across many armies tend to cluster in a broadly similar size range, large enough to function as a real fighting force, small enough that every soldier in it personally knows the people beside him. The Roman army's basic subunit, the century, nominally numbered around 80 to 100 soldiers under one commanding officer, a size where a leader could plausibly know every man under him by name and reputation. Nobody in that army was running neocortex calculations. They arrived at roughly the right number through a much cruder method. Centuries of trial and error about how large a unit can stay cohesive under real pressure before it starts fragmenting into confusion, favoritism, or cliques nobody can manage. Picture a company that started with 12 founders who all knew each other's family situations without trying. By year 3, it's 200 people, and leadership still talks about it like one big team. All hands meetings that used to be real conversations turn into one-way monologues because half the room are strangers to each other now. Decisions that used to get made over lunch now require a formal process because nobody can safely assume everyone shares the same context anymore. None of that is really a failure of character or effort. It's what happens automatically once headcount crosses a threshold. The human brain was never built to track as a single unit, no matter how talented or well-intentioned the people running it are. Or picture something closer to an individual manager's experience. Someone gets promoted because they were excellent individually, and within a year they're responsible for 18 direct reports across 3 different functions. At first, they try to run it the way they'd run a team of 6. Real one-on-ones, personal knowledge of everyone's situation, hands-on feedback tailored to each person. It works for a few months. Then it quietly stops. The one-on-ones still happen on the calendar, but they turn into status updates instead of real conversations because there simply isn't enough attention left over to hold 18 people's full context at once. The manager doesn't consciously decide to disengage. The disengagement happens underneath conscious decision-making, as a direct consequence of running past a cognitive limit that was never really about effort in the first place. There's a simpler way to see the same wall coming, just by doing the arithmetic on time instead of trust. Imagine a manager with 20 direct reports who commits to just 30 honest minutes with each of them every 2 weeks, the bare minimum for a real one-on-one. That's already 10 hours every 2 weeks spent purely on individual check-ins before a single email, planning, meeting, or piece of actual work gets touched. Stretch that same manager to genuinely knowing each person, not just checking a box on a calendar, and the math stops working entirely. The ceiling isn't philosophical. It's a straightforward consequence of there being exactly 24 hours in a day and only so many of them available for any one relationship. But here's the part nobody expects. 150 was never really the number that matters for management. It's far too generous for that purpose. Knowing someone well enough to recognize them and catch up with them at a conference is one kind of knowing. Knowing someone well enough to actually manage them well, to understand what motivates them specifically, where they're quietly stuck, what kind of feedback lands with them, and what kind bounces off entirely, is a completely different and much more demanding kind of knowing. Long-standing management research and practice both point to a far smaller number for that kind of close, effective oversight, often cited somewhere around 5 to 8 direct reports before real quality starts to break down. Below roughly that number, a manager can hold genuine specific context on every person, their current projects, their personal working style, what kind of week they're having, what they need to grow next. Above it, something shifts quietly, almost invisibly. The manager rarely notices the exact moment it happens. The one-on-ones stay on the calendar. The performance reviews still get written on schedule. But the actual content of those conversations changes character, sliding from real mentorship, feedback rooted in what this specific person needs right now, into something closer to administrative tracking. Generic status checks, boilerplate feedback that could apply to almost anyone on the roster, management by spreadsheet instead of management by relationship. Management theory has circled this exact idea for a long time, under a different name: span of control. It's the classic organizational design question of how many people can report directly to one manager before that manager's actual effectiveness starts to drop. Different companies and different eras have argued for different precise numbers over the decades, but almost none of the serious estimates land anywhere close to Dunbar's outer ring of 150. Nearly all of them land much closer to Dunbar's inner rings instead, typically somewhere in the 5 to 15 range, which lines up neatly with Dunbar's own description of the tightest, highest trust circles rather than the loose, low-context outer band. You can see the same underlying instinct in the small team philosophy that some technology companies have deliberately built their structure around. Keep any single team small enough that everyone genuinely knows what everyone else is working on. And once a team outgrows that, split it rather than let it quietly bloat into something unmanageable. It's the identical logic the materials science company applied to entire factories, just running at team scale instead of facility scale. Different industries, same underlying cognitive constraint discovered independently, decades apart. There's a modern wrinkle worth noting too. Dunbar's own later research pushed back on the idea that social media has expanded any of this. Massive follower counts and huge friend lists look, on paper, like proof that people can now maintain thousands of real relationships instead of 150. Dunbar's research suggests otherwise. Total follower count balloons, but the number of people someone actually interacts with in any meaningful reciprocal way stays remarkably close to the same old range. The platform changed. The underlying cognitive ceiling didn't move at all. If anything, it's a useful reminder that adding headcount to a team, like adding contacts to a phone, doesn't expand how many people a brain can genuinely track. It just expands how many names show up on a list that nobody has real context on. Here's the uncomfortable part for a lot of managers listening to this. This ceiling isn't a personal failing you can push through with better time management or more discipline. It's a structural constraint built into how human attention works. And treating it like a discipline problem instead of a design problem is exactly how conscientious, well-meaning managers burn themselves out trying to genuinely know 15 or 20 people at once, on top of doing their actual job. The practical fix isn't heroics, and it isn't a productivity hack either. It's layering the structure itself. If a team has grown past the number where one person can actually know each individual well, the answer isn't to try harder at knowing all of them simultaneously. The answer is to build a real layer underneath the top manager. Identify the people on the team who are ready to take on direct ownership of a small group of their own, hand them genuine authority over 5 to 8 people each, not just a title, and let the senior manager's own direct relationships narrow back down to a number their brain can actually hold on to with real context. Skip-level check-ins, done occasionally and deliberately, can keep the senior manager from going completely blind to what's happening 2 layers down, without requiring them to personally carry full context on every person in the building. Choosing who takes on that lead layer matters as much as creating it. The right candidates aren't necessarily the strongest individual performers. They're the people already informally doing the work of knowing others. The ones teammates already go to for context or advice without being told to. Handing that person formal ownership of 5 to 8 people is usually just recognizing a relationship that already exists rather than manufacturing one from nothing. A reasonable cadence underneath that structure is a short skip-level conversation every month or two, not to manage around the new leads, but to keep a general sense of the wider group without trying to personally hold deep context on all of them. Done well, this doesn't shrink coverage. Everyone still has a manager who genuinely knows them. It just stops, depending on one person's cognitive bandwidth, stretching further than any human bandwidth actually can. The senior manager stays close to fewer people, but stays close in a way that's real. The team leads underneath stay close to their own small groups. Nobody is quietly sliding from mentorship into headcount tracking without noticing. Because nobody is being asked to carry more direct relationships than their own attention can actually support. Next time your org chart claims you manage 20 people, try an honest test. Pick 5 of them at random and see how much specific, accurate detail you can describe about each one without checking a file first. Whatever number comes out of that test is the real number, not the one on the chart. If this sounds like your office, follow for more.